Welcome to this first episode on a GCSE series on an Inspector Goole. Over the next 10 weeks, as we come up to the GCSEs, I'm going to be giving you lots of tips and tricks and key quotes and model answers on how to approach this part of the exam. So the overview, there's Naveen. The overview of this session is going to basically be looking at some characters, which will include Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling, Sheila, Eric, Gerald, Eva, the inspector. So there's lots and lots of characters that we have to cover. Capitalism versus socialism as one of the themes, class division as one of the other themes, corruption as one of the other themes. We'll be covering the context, which for most exam boards is really important as well. So looking at Edwardian England, what the world of 1912 was like, which is when Priestley set this play, and also post-war England, which is when Priestley wrote this play. We'll be going through some model answers, as I said, and model paragraphs. I'll try and do one of those each week if I can. And then we'll also have a little bit of time for feedback, questions answered, that sort of thing as well. So today's lesson, we're going to be going straight into the inspector and thinking about him and his role. So get ready to make some notes. There's also a copy of the small group notes for you in the description, and if you're on the Discord channel, then in Discord. So I can't take credit for the slideshow. One of my other students actually created this and did a fantastic job of it. One thing that's kind of interesting though is the little balancing weighing scales in the background of this one, and it says if you can't convene them, confuse them. Obviously that's a typo. It's meant to be if you can't convince them, but I can't change it, so because it's an image. So sorry about that. So let's talk about the inspector. Let's talk about his role. Let's talk about how you would talk about him in the exam. Basically, the inspector is what you might call the moral arbiter of the play. What that means is he represents justice. He represents standing up for the little guy or the little girl, in this case, Eva Smith. She, of course, has died a horrible, hideous death based on the injustices of the world that she lived in. And he comes in to defend that. He's very unusual for the time of 1912. We get suggestions from Mr. Burling and from some other characters that most of the police and the inspectors are basically owned by the upper class at this time in history. So, you know, when the inspector first comes in, Mr. Burling offers him a drink, and the inspector says, "No thanks, Mr. Burling, I'm on duty." And this kind of throws Mr. Burling immediately, because Mr. Burling is like, well, hang on a minute. You know, all the other police inspectors that I deal with have a drink with me, and it's almost like a social club or a friendship. And obviously that then perverts justice, because if you're friends with the person you're supposed to be interrogating, then you're not going to do your job properly and actually prosecute them if they need prosecution. So this throws Mr. Burling. It shows that there's this shift, but also the inspector, I think, represents a more forward-thinking idea, right? So in 1912, in the Edwardian time, there was massive class division between the working, upper and middle classes. There was more of a patriarchal society. Women did not have equal rights with men. They didn't have the right to vote, for example. That was a big deal, of course. And then they won that right in 1918. That's a good context thing to remember for this play. And effectively, the upper class were more or less untouchable in some sense in 1912. There were no workers' rights. People at that time weren't really able to ask for pay rises. Obviously, Mr. Burling doesn't even give Eva a pay rise. When she asks, he even fires her for it. So the inspector is effectively like a justice that is needed, but not understood in 1912. But in 1945, when this play was first being performed in Russia and then in London, the people of 1945 would have been much more sympathetic to this. They wouldn't have seen class division as such a rigid thing. Think about it this way: all of the men who went off to fight in the war and all of the women who had kept the country running had been working together, you know, the whole keep calm and carry on of World War II. And so, you know, these class divisions would have been eroded because upper class men were fighting alongside working class men in the fields, and upper class women were working alongside working class women to keep the country running while most of the men were off fighting. So it makes sense that the inspector is ahead of his time, because he sort of represents the more modern thinking. So other than that, one of the big things that we need to remember is that the inspector represents social responsibility. That's another big theme in the play. And social responsibility is, oh, we've got Priya joining as well. So social responsibility is also really, really important in the play, because effectively the reason that Priestley suggests that we went to war in World War I and World War II is the fact that there was no sense of social responsibility. You had an upper class that owned basically all of the wealth, all of the property, all of the factories, right? Then you had a working class that owned nothing, but didn't even have unions or workers' rights to defend themselves. So the inspector steps in as a hero in some sense and says, hang on a minute, we need to have more social responsibility here. One final thing I'll say about social responsibility, thinking about the inspector, a good thing to remember and note down, in 1948, the NHS was founded in the UK. And that marks a huge shift in sort of social responsibility, effectively, right? Because before 1948, technically, if you got ill, very ill, let's say, God forbid, you had cancer, something awful like that, if you didn't have the amount of money to pay for the treatments, then you were more or less on your own. Now, obviously, a lot of things would fill that gap, but before the NHS, you had things like charities. A lot of people were religious, so you would have had like the churches and temples and so on donating to their members that were sick, but there wasn't a social security blanket. And the NHS obviously represents a much more socially responsible medicine, because what we now say, and what we're proud to say is, as British people, is if you're sick but you don't have the money to pay for your treatment, we will look after you as a society. We all pay a little bit more in taxes so that the sick can be treated for free, right? For free. So that's a huge deal. And that, again, is something that the inspector is representing here in this play. And this is obviously what J.B. Priestley wanted. He was a socialist. He was such a socialist, in fact, that some of his radio broadcasts got banned. That's how socialist he was at that time. So let's dive into some quotes for the inspector now, and then we'll try and get a model answer in as well before the end of the session. So the first thing about the inspector is that he need not be a tall man. I really like that as one of the first stage directions at the very beginning as he enters in Act 1. Now, the reason that I think that's so important, he need not be a tall man, is because his ideas are his power. Okay, his ideas are his power. So it's not that the inspector is this massive, scary, intimidating guy, which is more like Mr. Burling, by the way. Mr. Burling is described as being like this big, heavy-looking, intimidating guy. The inspector doesn't need to be an actor that looks like that, or a person that looks like that, because it's his ideas that speak for him. And effectively, Priestley is trying to say that he speaks the truth, and he follows the truth, and he's not corrupted. And obviously, we find out that he's not even a man. He's some sort of a spiritual being or a ghost at the end of the play. He has a sense of solidity and purposefulness. So again, with this one here, the sense of solidity and purposefulness, those adjectives, solidity and purposefulness, really help to consolidate what he's like as a character. If you think about how that presents him, think about the word solid and think about the connotations of the word solid. So the solidity of the man suggests that people like Mr. Burling, when they sort of run up against the inspector, they're just hit by this wall of truth and justice that they can't break through. And that's obviously how the inspector then is used to transform other characters. So Sheila is transformed by the inspector because she effectively has her lifestyle and way of thinking. And then there's the inspector that is this solid wall, and she runs into that wall and she just falls back down and realizes the error of her ways. Ditto Eric. Eric also transforms thanks to him. Unfortunately, the older generation of the Mr. and Mrs. Burling, Arthur and Sybil, they don't transform, but they do. Mrs. Burling is described as collapsing in Act 3 because she has faced this solidity of the inspector, this truth that he brings, this justice that he brings, and she can't deny that. She can't really defend what she's done. And purposefulness. This is maybe one of the most underrated little quotes. He has come here to kick some ass. He is not here for a cup of tea and a chat. He is here to break down social divisions, injustices. And that's one of the most intimidating things about the inspector as a character. He has this drive and this purposefulness behind him. And that is what makes him so powerful as well. Multiple times in the play, he has the stage direction of cutting in or massively cutting in or taking charge. These stage directions are really, really good for thinking about the power and authority of the inspector. The fact that the inspector represents perhaps the middle class, maybe arguably even more the working class, certainly not the upper class. And yet he cuts in and talks over Mr. and Mrs. Burling, which would have been unheard of for 1912 society. And he also, I've just realized I didn't FLF, sorry about that. He also takes charge the whole time. So again, the upper class were normally the ones that would take charge of things and run the world. But he, while he is here, is the one that takes charge. He sets the agenda and he does it his way. Think about the way that he shows people the photographs or the photograph. He shows it to Mr. Burling first. Eric and Gerald get up to try to speak with, to see the photo, and he doesn't let them see the photo. He cuts in their way and stops them. He takes charge. He makes sure that the way that he wants to run his investigation goes the way he wants. And that's a huge deal as well in showing his power and authority. At one point, he literally holds up his hand and everyone stops speaking. So again, that shows his power and authority. I want you to think particularly about Mr. and Mrs. Burling here. How often do you think that someone holds up their hand and they stop speaking? Never. This may have never happened to them in their entire lives. And that's what he represents again. Then the other thing that the inspector foreshadows or forebodes is World War I and then World War II. So obviously the play is set in 1912. The war happened, First World War happens in 1914, second happens in 1939, and then this play is written in 1945. Okay, so the fact that he says as he's leaving in Act 3, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. This is a tricolon / a triadic structure. And in this triadic structure, we have all this war imagery, which is meant to quite literally be the inspector suggesting, if we don't get to a stage where we have a more equal society with less class division, less corruption, less problems, then the only path forward for us as a civilization is war. Now, we can argue back and forth whether Priestley was right that war was due to this or not. I probably lean towards this was one factor of multiple factors, but this is again a very moralistic message that Priestley is trying to convey through this. We've got a few more quotes I'd like to dive into, but these are gold. I want you to remember these quotes. I want you to remember what I'm saying about them, because if a question comes up on the inspector, these are direct quotes and direct ideas that you can explain and get more marks in your essay. He explains that Eva Smith had been turned out and turned down too many times. Now, this quote here is really presenting his empathy for the character. So a lot of the people of the time of 1912 would not have really cared for each other. It would have been more of a dog-eat-dog kind of world. Yet the inspector, by showing this understanding and this empathy, shows why he is such a good person to be put into the position of an inspector, because he is going to defend the truth. He's going to defend people. We'll have to share our guilt. We'll have to share our guilt. So this quote creates a collective, and it forms what's called a dichotomy with Mr. Burling. Yeah, let's see if I can just about fit that in. Nope, I'm gonna have to expand it again, no problem. A collective or a dichotomy with Mr. Burling. So Mr. Burling talks about how it's nonsense that we should have to work together like bees in a hive. He's like, that's nonsense, we shouldn't have to do that. Whereas the inspector not only feels that we are a collective, but he feels it to the point that he says, look, if I fail to make you see your social responsibility, then I'm also a little bit guilty because I'm not holding you accountable for what needs to happen in society. So it's a radically different way of thinking about the world. And again, that links to the way that we might think about the NHS. The NHS being a sense of, look, if people are dying in our society because they can't afford medicine, then that's kind of a collective guilt that we have to deal with. Just because, you know, that's a failing in our society, basically. And obviously the NHS helps to cover that. What happened to her afterwards and what happened to her after, what happened to her afterwards? I've just repeated that there, my bad. So what happened to her afterwards? The other thing that the inspector is really good at is talking about this chain of events. So again, the thinking of 1912 is very much in the moment. We think about Mr. Burling. Mr. Burling talks about how the Titanic is unsinkable. He doesn't, and he thinks about how the world is going to get better and better. He thinks very much about in the moment. He doesn't think about the consequences. So the fact that we have the inspector thinking about the consequences of actions, that's another tool which he uses to try to mete out justice and to create social responsibility. One of my favorite quotes in the entire play now, I don't play golf. And actually I should add, there's a stage direction before this. He says this dryly, I don't play golf. There we go. So this is what we call subtext. The subtext of this is the fact that golf at that time, even today to some extent, I suppose, kind of represented the upper class a little bit. And so when the inspector comes in and says, I don't play golf, he's basically subtextually being like, screw you, Mr. Burling. I'm not upper class. I don't want to be upper class. I don't want to be your friend. I'm here to interrogate you. I'm here to bring you to justice. So again, this is a really kind of intimidating, almost terrifying thing for Mr. Burling to hear. Yet it's very subtle because this is at the very beginning of the inspector coming into the play. Two more. When he talks about Eva Smith, he says about how she died in misery, agony, hating life. So again, we have this triad, tricolon and triadic structure. And again, this is for emphasis. And the reason that he's trying to use these triads or tricolons to emphasize when he talks about Eva Smith and when he talks about the future war that will come is he's really trying to convert these people to social responsibility and to understanding that they have power and therefore they have responsibility to the society, which they should be serving, not feeding off of like parasites. Final one, public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. I feel like I'm beating the same drum to some extent here. Obviously, again, this represents social responsibility, represents justice. It represents him trying to convert Mr. Burling into a man who understands his place in society as someone with wealth and power and influence more. Okay. Final thing I'll say about the inspector, and then we'll write a paragraph on him. The next slide will not be anywhere near as pretty, I'm afraid, but never mind, is going to be the supernatural element to the inspector. I think it's important that we talk about that just briefly. So the inspector is funnily named Inspector Goole, right? And obviously the word ghoul links to ghosts. It's a synonym. Obviously, we normally would spell it G-O-H-U-L like that, but it links to spirits and ghosts and so on. So the fact that he so desperately tries to convert Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Eric and Sheila and Gerald is a mercy. It's almost seen as like a higher power, basically, that's come down to try and fix this injustice. And we get the sense that if Mr. and Mrs. Burling had learned their lesson the way that Eric and Sheila had, and also Gerald didn't learn either, we get this sense that maybe Eva Smith's death would not have happened, and maybe it would have changed the course of history. So again, that's the depth of Inspector Goole. If any questions do pop up, feel free to ask me in our lessons as well, obviously, about them. So we're just going to keep it quite simple. How is Inspector Goole presented? Why is he a significant character? So the way that we want to talk about the inspector, as I said, is through the ideas and the themes which he represents, and perhaps the relationships and conflicts between those relationships with other characters, because he basically butts heads with everyone else. And then we want to finish up with a little bit of context as well. So we want a strong point, we want our evidence, technique, explanation, perhaps a bit of reader response, and then we want to finish up with some context, okay? So the quote that I am going to look at is going to be effectively how he represents social responsibility. And I'm going to talk about I don't play golf, and I'm also going to talk about his sense of solidity, okay? So we'll start off with our point. One of the most significant characteristics of the inspector is his enforcement of social responsibility within the Edwardian society which he serves. We note this in the line, dryly, I don't play golf. The subtext of this line, so notice that's the technique in this case. A lot of lines in plays will have subtext. It's a really good technique to talk about, and we'll maybe also talk about the stage direction here. The subtext of this line suggests to the audience the fact that the inspector is not going to become corrupted by Mr. Burling, since golf symbolizes the upper class, and by rejecting this sport, the inspector is rejecting the upper class and the greed that the greed and power that it holds in the Edwardian society. Okay, so that's the first bit about how it's talking about social responsibility, the fact that he rejects which shuns its social responsibility. So that's the first quote that you could use, and there's a little bit of analysis for you. The next quote, it's always good to try and use two quotes if you can, or if not, break down two parts from a quote. In this case, I'm going to do two different quotes. Furthermore, when the inspector arrives and is described as having a, quote, solidity to him, what we see is how he holds power to bring social responsibility to others, since his viewpoint of the world seems to represent the truth in a way that none of the other characters Then we go into the context and the reader response. As the reader, the power of the inspector makes us consider social responsibility more closely, and we seem to, and we we relate to the inspector as a protagonist more than the Burlings as antagonists. This is significant because when the play was written and performed in 1945, social responsibility was more carefully being enacted in society in Britain. Just make this a bit smaller. Carefully being enacted in Britain through initiatives such as the founding of the NHS, socially responsible. Great if I could spell medical care. Okay, so there, obviously I've just done that in about 7 or 8 minutes, but there is a model paragraph for you.